if you want to really see something that's said, take a look at what happened.
Moving his spear. Hold. When you're ready. On you. Ready. Move. Up. Move.
Hey, everybody. Welcome into an all-new episode of the Can We Please Talk podcast. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
And I'm Nick Saveri.
On the program today, more on the assassination attempt of former President Donald John Trump. Can't even believe I'm saying it. We'll get into it in just a second, but a look at everything that took place this past Saturday in Butler, Pennsylvania at a Trump rally where 20-year-old suspect Thomas Matthew Crooks took shot from a nearby structure, shooting a few times at the former president while he was speaking at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. The Secret Service killing the suspect. One other person died at the scene that was shot as part of the bullets that missed the former president. And two other people are critically injured at this moment. The FBI is currently working to determine a motive for the attack. We're going to get into all of it in a second. Plus, later on in the program, joining us to talk about not only what happened this past Saturday at this rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, but also the latest on the wars happening with Israel and Gaza and Russia, Ukraine. Former deputy training director for the National Security Agency. He worked for the United States Air Force for forever. He's a military analyst over at CNN. Colonel Cedric Leighton is going to be joining us on the program. The timing could not be better, but obviously under these circumstances, very tough to talk about what happened this past Saturday, but the Colonel is going to be joining us. Originally, he was supposed to join us just to talk about the wars that are happening and the latest with all of that surrounding Israel and Gaza and Russia, Ukraine. Now we're going to ask him in our next segment a little bit more about what he knows details-wise as somebody who worked for one of these agencies. There's a lot of coordination that goes on between, obviously, the Secret Service, local law enforcement, all of this at an event level. Nick, before I say hello to you, I know we normally exchange pleasantries here. We played at the top of the show this clip that is jarring of what took place, the shooting as he's speaking. Again, this is like one of those 1-2 hour things that he has, that he does these outdoor venues, speaking engagements. We tend to brush over them sometimes. Sometimes we pull clips from them. We analyze, we talk about it. There was a few members of Congress in there. The core press is attending this event. So there's a lot of people, even sometimes folks that we happen to know that are covering this event. Fortunately, we don't know anybody from the outlets that were there, amongst them Washington Post, Washington Examiner, New York Times. We don't happen to know some of the people that were at this particular event. A lot of them have kind of shifted to go to Milwaukee because the RNC convention is happening this week. So thankfully for that, nobody that we happen to know or friends of the pods were injured in this. But this is just a crazy scenario. Before we're going to each give kind of our perspectives and takes on all of this. But before we kind of get rolling here, current President Joe Biden spoke with the former president last night. At the time of his recording, because he went out to, talk to the press about this, he gave a little bit of a speech, and I want to play a little bit for you here. We're going to react on the other side. So everybody take a listen to this.
I have tried to get a hold of Donald. He's with his doctors. Apparently he's doing well. I plan on talking to him shortly, I hope, when I get back to the telephone. Look, there's no place in America for this kind of violence. It's sick. It's sick. It's one of the reasons why we have to unite this country. We cannot allow for this to be happening. We cannot be like this. We cannot condone this. And I want to thank the Secret Service and all the agencies, including the state agencies, that have been engaged in making sure that The people who, and we have more detail to come relative to other people maybe injured in the audience. I don't have all that detail. We'll make that available to you. I may be able to come back a little later tonight, but we'll put out a statement if I'm not able to give, if it's not convenient for you all. But the bottom line is that the Trump rally was a rally that he should have been able to be conducted peacefully without any problem. But the idea that there's political violence or violence in America like this is just unheard of. It's just not appropriate.
So you hear the president obviously condemning violence. So I'm going to get into that in a little bit of my spiel in just a second, but the message is the same. Let's condemn violence, no matter who it is. We're going to get into some of this other stuff. And Nick, I don't want to speak for Nick on any of this because Nick has his own opinion on this. We've been texting back and forth about this. If you listen to the show, you know that neither one of us happen to like the policy positions of the former president, to say the least. That doesn't mean that he should be taken out. I mean, give me a break. And seeing this unfold yesterday got me thinking about 1981. Again, I was born that year, but not when this happened. And obviously the assassination attempt with Ronald Reagan, the ducking behind a limousine, a Secret Service covering him, Vice President George H.W. Bush giving a speech afterwards to let everybody know how Reagan was doing in all of this. And it got me thinking about that particular moment in time, because again, I happened to be watching the news with my wife at the time. We were just home, and seeing this. So it's a slow news day. The RNC is happening this coming week, So everything's kind of transitioning to that. So here's the former president giving a speech. Of course, some of the networks are going to take it, seeing that kind of play out. And then the responses on social media have been crazy. I'm going to get into that in just a second. The first thing I want to play, though, is as this investigation is unfolding, a lot of people are going to overanalyze the Secret Service's job in all of this. There's a lot of people coming out already saying they did a great job. You saw how fast they jumped on top of the president. You could have heard it a little bit there in the video. They instantly swarmed him. They communicated who was shooting. The counter snipers were shooting across the way. But there was one key piece of, an interview that's been making the rounds, and it's been going across social media. It was conducted by the BBC News that happened to be covering this event as well, of somebody that was watching the rally from afar. And they saw this person climbing on the structure, and they couldn't understand why no one was doing anything about this. Almost as if, hey, this guy is going up there with malice intent. He's got a gun. He's not a law enforcement official. He's got a T-shirt on and jeans. He looks like he's going to kill somebody. Take a listen to what this person that was there at the rally said.
We noticed a guy crawling, bear crawling up the roof of the building beside us, 50 feet away from us. So we're standing there, we're pointing at the guy crawling up the roof.
And he had a gun, right?
He had a rifle.
A rifle.
We could clearly see him with a rifle. Absolutely. We're pointing at him. The police are down there running around on the ground. We're like, hey, man, there's a guy on the roof with a rifle. And the police were like, huh, what? Like they didn't know what was going on. I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, why is Trump still speaking? Why have they not pulled him off the stage? I'm standing there pointing at him for 2-3 minutes. Secret Service is looking at us from the top of the barn. I'm pointing at that roof, just standing there like this.
In the coming days, weeks, months, all this will be investigated, and we'll find out more and more information about not only this shooter, how he was able to do what the person just said there in the clip, and how he was able to kind of not get past security because he was outside of the perimeter that they set up for all of this. He did this with a long rifle, right? All of that is going to be examined. I'm going to ask the colonel a little bit about that in just a second as well. But my biggest thing for me watching this unfold yesterday, seeing everything transpire on social media, seeing the positions of people on the left that cannot remove political partisanness from this. And I get that to a certain extent. But this is where I want to start. The first thing is this. For you conspiracy theorists out there, this is not the show for you. You may want to turn this off. You may want to go listen to Dan Bongino, or you may want to go listen to somewhere else that's going to placate to that. I don't have time for that. I can't join you in. I'm not going to live there. I don't want to live there. And if you live there, then you should be living in the panhandle with no phone and cash under a mattress because you think everything's a conspiracy. So I better not see you online at the Apple store buying a new Apple phone. That's number one. I can't live in this world where that was staged yesterday or 2 days ago. I can't live there. You want to live there? You think because he grabbed his ear and a bullet grazed, by the way, it looks like the bullet hit one of the teleprompters, which shattered glass, which is what hit him in the ear, which is why he started looking at it like funny, then heard the shots and ducked down. You want to say all of that is staged? All of that was coordinated? 2 people critically injured, 1 person already dead, a former president almost shot dead. You want to say all of that was staged just so he can gain political points and potentially win the election in November? That is a train I'm not getting on, my friend. That's your train. As they say in Cuba, ese tu maletín, which means that's your suitcase. It doesn't translate loosely, but that's yours. I can't join you in that. I'm sorry. That was way too much happening to be staged. That's number one. The second part in all of this is that we're at a critical juncture right now where this was to be expected. Let's be honest, folks. What happened with Paul Pelosi and that break-in, the video of that guy hammering the former speaker's husband at his San Francisco home, the rhetoric that we heard from people on the far right about that. Now the same far right people are doing the same thing, saying Joe Biden is responsible for this assassination attempt. The rhetoric around all of this. We got to start having some self-awareness here. Because the same way I just criticize people that are saying this is staged and that all of this is nonsense, most of those are far left or left-leaning people, is the same thing I'm going to say to the people that are on this far right, the Lauren Boeberts, the Marjorie Taylor Greens. You know, the true people that wake up in the morning that know that money is associated with living with this philosophical idea. I'm just going to put it out there for you. I happen to know some of these people, so this is why this is a little bit troubling to me. And I got a lot of text messages yesterday for people asking me to break this down. I'm not in law enforcement. All I can do is break down the political analysis of all of this because I kind of live in the ethos now. The biggest thing for me is that when I see Lauren Boebert tweeting out that Joe Biden needs to apologize for this, I know that she knows the money's being made in putting that out. She doesn't truly feel like that. Is she conservative? 100%, folks. Does she want to go away from pronouns and filling that out on a form? Yes. Does she think gender is man and a woman? Yes. All of that, yes. At a certain point, though, she heightens it and she has to repeat certain things because there's an audience that's following. And if not, another dumb brunette is going to do it. That's the way it works. For every Kayleigh McInerney, there was a Megyn Kelly before that. If you don't know, now you know, to quote Biggie. That's their mechanism of making money. They know that. They don't want to tell you that out front. Sometimes they'll give you a little inkling. You got to pick up on that. So I say all that to say the people that are right now on the far right saying that Joe Biden needs to apologize for this assassination attempt, do me a favor and shut up. Do me a favor. Because we don't believe you at all. Just like we don't believe the staged people, I can't believe that. This is a place to analyze political events, factor in data, and I live in fact fiction. Not my facts, not your facts. There is no such thing as that. There's your version of the story, but then there's what actually happened. It's on video. Just like January 6th happened, it's on video. Okay? I can't live in the other parts. Plants, Antifa. I can't live in that. You want to live in that? Again, this is not the show for you. Do me a favor, unsubscribe. If you want to listen to an analysis of this, and then obviously somebody who's worked in the government with respect to, you know, overseeing an agency, and again, in a different sector, Colonel Leighton. But if you want to listen to subject matter experts talk about the breakdown of all this, where do we go from here? This is the show for you. So that's 1 and 2. Can't live in conspiracy land and say this is staged. Also can't live in conspiracy land and say that Joe Biden set this all up. Now, the third part in all of this, the former president of the United States with the convention this week, if he doesn't realize that he should be 6 feet underground right now, if the shooter had properly hit him, if he doesn't realize that and carry a softer tone into the convention this week, more of this is going to happen. For the past 3, 4, 5 years, specifically the last 3 after losing the election, he has had rhetoric that has blamed the far left in this country, saying that the election's stolen. We know it's not. You know how I know it's not? He's participating in it again. I've said this a bunch of times. If something is stolen from you, you've been cheated on it, you don't keep doing it a third time. He has had that kind of tone and rhetoric that has incited violence. Right now is not the time for all of that. He needs to look in the mirror. And I know Nick's going to go to his point about the former president and, shooting, gun control. I get all of it. I get all of it. I'm saying right now, in this moment in time, come Thursday, when the president is set to speak at the RNC, the former president is set to speak at the RNC in Milwaukee. If he doesn't realize that he should probably be dead today, and he's fortunate enough to live, he needs to communicate that to everybody in Milwaukee this coming Thursday, that I survived and now it's time to unify. And this is the Republican platform, and it's not going to be about, because he can end it all. He can end it all. Not Joe Biden. Remember, Joe is Sleepy Joe. Joe doesn't know where he is, but yet he's a criminal mastermind. Can't have it both ways, everybody. Okay? One person can do something about what we saw play out this past Saturday, and his name is Donald John Trump. He knows that he has the ability right now to tell the Freedom Caucus folks, to tell surrogates that go on TV, to go campaign managers, anybody. You can still keep it the message of we need to beat the Democrats in the fall. But the message can't be the radical left tried to kill me, blah, 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 blah. That is not proven to be true so far early in the investigation. Stop with this bullshit. What happened on Saturday is a travesty, an atrocity, but could have been prevented with softer rhetoric than the one he's been doing over the last 4 years. And the issue is now, more than ever, now that there was already one attempt, that there may be more. And not only to him, to current President Biden. And now everyone is heightened. So what do we do when everybody's heightened? What do we do when the faucet's going crazy? What do we do when the fire hydrant's broken and sprouting out water? What do? Do we keep throwing more water on it? Or do we try to turn it off? Right now is the time for former President Trump to turn it the fuck off. And I'm using this type of language because there may be people that listen to this show that are on that fringe, that are in that rhino category, or that are in that Republican, I'm going to have to vote for, Donald Trump because I vote R no matter what. For those of you that listen to this show that have known me for a long time, understand that I don't like Donald Trump. That doesn't mean that I can't be fair in the assessment of Saturday was a travesty. And if that person, the shooter, had survived, prosecute him to the fullest extent of the law. Condolences to the people that were killed. Kudos to the Secret Service for doing their job. We don't wish this upon anybody. I don't got time for joking. I got a text message on Saturday, Nick, from a friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours, and right away wanting to joke about, this. This is not funny. The dude almost lost his life. I don't want him to lose his life. I just don't want him to be president of the United States. And in that same vein, we need to have that type of conversation. But as I've said numerous times on this show, but I'm going to turn it over to you, Nick, in a sec. The conversation's got to be on the up and up. There has to be some self-awareness here. And the self-awareness lives in that the former president has been trafficking in this type of rhetoric and content, where now somebody took it upon themselves, a 20-year-old kid took it upon himself to get a long rifle, go through all of this, and try to take him out. And we haven't seen that in this country's history in 43 years. 43 years since our last Republican president. So it's time for him to understand that he needs to tone this down. All right, Nick, I said a lot there. Now, obviously, everything with the video footage, you heard the sound. Give me some of your initial reactions on what played out this past Saturday.
You know, on Saturday, I saw a man who courted violence get a taste of what it's like when that violence is directed at him. I saw a man who displayed ambivalence toward Nazis in Charlottesville, Virginia, be exposed to the same level of violence that resulted in a protester being run over by a car. A man who was just missed by an assassin's bullet, who only a few years ago stirred up sentiment to overthrow an election and bring violence to the U.S. Capitol. For as long as I can recall Donald Trump talking, he has referenced violence as a solution when it fits his needs. Hence, he openly supports dictators like Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. On Saturday, I saw a man get introduced to karma. With that in mind, an assassination is not going to stop the MAGA movement. You don't stop ideas with violence. That's the mentality of demagogues and wannabe dictators. It's not what we do in the United States. My hope is that Donald Trump, after getting a taste of what happens when his rhetoric raises the temperature a little too high, rethinks how he talks about his political opponents or those who do not agree with his policy vision or his overall views. But I doubt it. If there's one thing that's clear about Donald Trump, is that he has no remorse. He has no back down. As we approach the Republican National Convention, my guess is that the former president will utilize Saturday's violence to make himself a martyr. And worse, he likely will demand that the violence that he experienced on Saturday be met in kind going forward. He never learns.
I will say, you know, you stole a little bit of what I said there as well in the end, because you're right. Like I said in the beginning, there's one person that can change all of this. It's him. It's him. As I was saying to a friend of mine earlier today, playing golf, he can easily tell Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, and the like of the Freedom Caucus to shut up, and stop it. One person that's trying to stop all of this, or at least tone down the temperature, is, I mentioned President Biden, but we played at the beginning what he said in the immediate aftermath of this shooting without information. Nikki, as we're recording this, he just spoke from the Oval Office a little while ago. And I want to play just his introduction to what he said to the American people at 8 p.m. last night. Take a listen.
I want to speak to you tonight about the need for us to lower the temperature in our politics. And to remember, while we may disagree, we are not enemies. We're neighbors. We're friends, co-workers, citizens, and most importantly, we're fellow Americans. We must stand together. Yesterday's shooting at Donald Trump's rally in Pennsylvania calls on all of us to take a step back, take stock of where we are, how we go forward from here. Thankfully, former Trump is not seriously injured. I spoke with him last night. I'm grateful. He's doing well, and Jill and I keep him and his family in our prayers. We also extend our deepest condolences to the family of the victims who was killed. Corey was a husband, a father, a volunteer firefighter, a hero, sheltering his family from those bullets. We should all hold his family and all those injured in our prayers. Earlier today, I spoke about an ongoing investigation. We do not know the motive of the shooter yet. We don't know his opinions or affiliations. We don't know whether he had help or support or if he communicated with anyone else. Law enforcement professionals, as I speak, are investigating those questions. Tonight, I want to speak to what we do know. A former president was shot, an American citizen killed, while simply exercising his freedom to support the candidate of his choosing. We cannot, we must not go down this road in America. We've traveled before throughout our history. Violence has never been the answer. Whether it's with members of Congress of both parties being targeted and shot, or a violent mob attacking the Capitol on January 6th, or a brutal attack on the spouse of former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, or information and intimidation on election officials, or the kidnapping plot against the sitting governor, or an attempted assassination on Donald Trump. There's no place in America for this kind of violence, for any violence ever.
You heard the president there. And to put a bow on this before we go to the break, and Colonel Cedric Leighton, that's going to be joining us to talk a little bit more about not only what took place Saturday, but obviously the latest in the two wars between Israel and Gaza and Russia and Ukraine. There's a report right now coming out from CNN that Donald Trump obviously has landed in Milwaukee earlier today. The Republican National Convention is coming up this week. And there's a report that he's rewriting his speech to have a softer tone. Maybe that's the case. Maybe it's not. But I will tell you this, that as somebody, and again, not even closely relatable, but as somebody that was in a major car accident because of something I did wrong, it changed my life in terms of the way I thought about driving home late at night. Okay? I want to leave it at that because that life-changing event and not dying in that event, when a friend of mine from high school actually passed away in the same fashion, just not wearing a seatbelt, that changed my life. So if a bullet came near my head as somebody was trying to shoot at me, I think I would change my tone. But they always say you can't teach an old dog new tricks. So we're going to find out this week if Donald John Trump is going to start actually talking about his message to the American people, or is he just going to continue on with the greatest hits? We'll find out this week. When we come back after the break, Colonel Cedric Leighton going to break all of this down, talk about the wars. Colonel Leighton on the other side of the break. Quick break from the pod, as always, to tell you about our friends over at Fresh Roasted Coffee. Delicious tasting coffee that fuels me and Nick every episode. And now it's the summer months. It's hot out, iced coffee, cold brew, tea, iced tea specifically. Got to have all these drinks in these summer months. Nick, you a cold brew guy over there?
Yeah, absolutely. The second that the weather gets hot, my coffee gets cold. Damn, that was a nice line, actually.
That's all
but
right.
yeah, I just recently tried the cold brew. I was super excited about it. I definitely drink a lot of iced coffees and cold brews from different places. I order everything from Fresh Roasted Coffee, so the fact I can now get my cold brew as well from there, I'm totally in.
I knew you would be. And for the people out there that are listening, as always, thanks for supporting Fresh Roasted Coffee, because the blends, the flavors, the roast, you can go to their website by clicking the link in our show notes right now. Put in some cold brew into the shopping cart. When you get to checkout, enter in the promo code, can we please get 20, all one word, can we please get 2020? You're going to get 20% off that first purchase. All right, here to help us break down everything that happened recently this past weekend, obviously in the assassination attempt of the former president, but also the latest in the wars with respect to what's happening in Gaza, Israel and Gaza, and what's happening in Ukraine as well, between Russia and Ukraine. He's a former retired U.S. Air Force colonel. He's now a military analyst over at CNN, my buddy, Colonel Cedric Leighton. Colonel Leighton, Mike Leon, Nick Saveri, thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with us.
Oh, it's so great to be with you guys, Mike. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's good seeing you again. I saw you a few weeks ago, and I know under these circumstances, I had mentioned this in the first segment, that we had already booked you to obviously talk about the latest in these wars and the developments, right? Because we're heading into the RNC from a political cycle, and we didn't think anything like what happened on Saturday would take place. You know, it's been 43 years since the last assassination attempt on former President Ronald Reagan. I'm just curious for you because, you know, I know obviously you're in the TV throes and you're analyzing what takes place on the battlefield here, but you've worked for the U.S. government for so long, and seeing the former commander in chief almost shot and killed on a stage. What would you make of it all? Not only from what took place on Saturday, the Secret Service's work in protecting the former president, the ongoing investigation that the FBI is doing right now. What do you make of it all?
Yeah, Mike, it's of course, it was horrifying to see that anytime you get a video of a situation, or you're close to a situation where somebody is being shot, there's you wonder what went wrong, quite frankly. And when it comes to someone like former President Trump, who obviously is a high-level protectee of the Secret Service, you do have to wonder, what the difficulties were, what the issues were, and I think it goes to the challenges that you have in a situation. As a government person, I worked in the intelligence field for my Air Force career, so we would deal with, usually it would be the fallout of assassinations that happened on foreign soil. You would, see something about a foreign leader that that was killed, and then what the impact on U.S. foreign policy would be on the U.S. military potentially in certain situations. So my perspective was mainly focused on foreign situations, but I definitely remember the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. I was a college student at the time that happened, and every time you deal with something like that, you always wonder, gee, if I were in the shoes of the Secret Service, what would I have done? What could I have done? What could I have done better in a situation like that? And in this particular case, with the attempted assassination of former President Trump in Pennsylvania, the first obvious question seems to be why the shooter was allowed on that rooftop. That rooftop was about, I believe, 400 feet or so away from where the president was speaking. And that seems to be, pretty close to the perimeter of a major event like this. And any type of campaign event of a former president or a major presidential candidate is maybe not quite a national security event, but it should be handled pretty much like that. So, for example, the Super Bowl is a national security event, and people are concerned from a counterterrorism perspective, that there not be an incident at a venue like the Super Bowl or the World Series or Olympic Games, anything like that. And so the U.S. spends a lot of time from a counterterrorism perspective protecting people, the audience, in situations like that, the public at large. But they also want to protect senior people, senior politicians, athletes in the case of sporting events. And that does strain resources. And in the case of this particular situation with Donald Trump, it seems as if something was not quite communicated in the right way. Did they not know what the geography of the place was? Was there something that was missed? Were there there's some indication that people in the audience saw the shooter before he fired his shots, and they saw that he was going on the roof and was, in essence, targeting the stage, and if that message wasn't conveyed quickly enough to the Secret Service, then clearly there's some kind of a breakdown. And, in this era of crowdsourcing and of getting information from all kinds of sources, the challenge really becomes one of, in some respects, getting information quickly to the people who can act on it. So in this case, it would be the detail that was protecting the former president, plus the snipers that the U.S. Secret Service has in the counter sniper role that ended up taking out the shooter anyways. But of course, there were a few shots fired, and tragically, a person was killed who was in the audience, a firefighter, a 50-year-old firefighter, and of course 2 people were severely wounded, and that does represent a situation that you don't want to see. An investigation is obviously going to have to be conducted where they look at what actually went wrong and also what went right, and what things could be improved, what things did they do that they shouldn't have done, what things did they do that they could have done better at. So there's going to be a very extensive look at this, I'm certain, within the Secret Service. I did work a little bit with the FBI when I was in the Air Force. I did not work directly with the Secret Service, but those agencies are very good at doing their core mission areas, and you want to make sure that they can really carry out those core mission areas. And in this case, for the Secret Service, one of those core mission areas is, of course, protecting the president and the former president.
Let me ask you just one quick follow-up before we pivot, obviously, to the wars, because you kind of touched on it a little bit there. But now that you're on TV and you're seeing this kind of play out, and I think John Miller does a great job for CNN right now as the law enforcement security expert. But there's been so much made of, and you touched on the Secret Service's role in all of this, and how much exhaustive work goes into this, even though it's a former president. So it's a little bit of a scaled back version of what the current president's detail gets. But when you watch it from just an analyst perspective and you see how all of this kind of plays out and people are criticizing the Secret Service, you mentioned about what went right, what went wrong. What would you, if let's say you were part of this in terms of gathering the information as part of this, what do you think went right and what do you think went wrong in all of this?
Yeah, I think there's always a danger of rushing to conclusions, and you mentioned that a lot of our law enforcement analysts like John Miller are spending a lot of time on this, but they have a lot of expertise, a lot of experience with these areas. What I'd be looking for would be what was known about the shooter. This could very well be somebody who did not show up on the radar at all. And this compounds the problem from an intelligence perspective. There always has to be some degree of intelligence gathering when you set up for an event like this. And so you have to look at how was the advance work done? What did they know about the local environment? What did they know about the physical environment? What did they know about certain people who could potentially be threats to the former president? And what was done to neutralize those threats, in the sense of not eliminating these people, obviously, except in the case of the shooter, but making sure that they didn't cause any harm or couldn't cause any harm? Or was there nobody that was considered to be a threat, which is also possible, given the type of situation that you are dealing with in an area that is heavily politically heavily supportive of Donald Trump. So there are, certainly things there that need to be looked at. When you look at the specifics as far as the shooter is concerned, what kind of indications did he give off that he was going to do something like this? And if the answer is that he gave off none, that's also a warning sign that you still have to do that, what in the military we would call intelligence preparation of the battle space. You still have to do that intelligence collection preparatory to a big event like this, but you also have to be vigilant during the event, and in some cases immediately after the event, to make sure that there's no threat to not only the principal, in this case the former president, but also the attendees. And that's where I think a lot of questions will have to be asked. There may be a few competing investigations in this case, because I know Congress is going to be looking at this as well. But the who, what, and why of the situation would definitely be something that I would be looking for if I were looking as an investigator at this.
And I appreciate that insight. And like I said, again, not the reason why we had you on. I want to pivot to why we did want to have you on, because these foreign conflicts right now, we're going to get in a little bit into the NATO summit and obviously President Biden last week having all of these, leaders here in Washington, D.C., and also did something with President Zelensky as well as this Ukraine compact. I would love for you to explain, but let me pivot real quick to the Israel Gaza war, and I don't want to overshoot that like that in terms of real quick, because there's a lot going on here. There's over 35,000 or so dead in this conflict ever since October 7th. I want to get your perspective, because I've seen a bunch of your segments, obviously, on CNN, and obviously you're a colonel, you're a military expert. Nick and I are not military experts. Neither of us have served in the U.S. military. What should we make, just as citizens watching this all play out, getting into the latest of what's happening right now? There's no ceasefire talks, that they've kind of broken down, so we don't know about the hostages yet. But what should people that are listening to this right now, that maybe because of what's happening here on U.S. soil, have lost track of the war itself, what should we make of Israel's military operations here and what they are doing in Gaza right now? What would you say to somebody that's listening to this right now? They see the death toll rising in Gaza, what the IDF is doing with respect to bombing in different locations in Gaza. It's everyone's described it as such a small place. We're putting hostages at risk. Some have even died in this conflict. Can you kind of explain what you think Israel's strategy is in all of this?
Yeah, so Mike, I think the big tenets of Israeli strategy are to, in essence, eliminate Hamas as a viable fighting force. Now, that is much easier said than done, and so here's the problem. What you have is, you mentioned Gaza being a small place, and that is certainly true. So you have a small, crowded place where you're trying to conduct military operations if you're the Israeli Defense Force, and you go in there, and every place you turn, think of being in a place that has narrow alleyways, crowded with all kinds of people. You don't know who these people are. Some of them have very strong loyalties to Hamas. You know that others may be a little bit more more or less tied to this group, but everyone is somehow beholden to Hamas in one way or the other. So they're not going to be your friends. So you are basically going into an extremely hostile environment if you're an IDF soldier. You go in there, you have a certain mission. One of those missions is to go after Hamas's leadership and eliminate them, either capture them or kill them. On the other side of it, you also have a mission to go in and rescue the hostages. And then the other part, the third part of it, is you have a mission to prevent the kind of attack that Hamas conducted on October the 7th, where they went in and they killed over 1,200 Israeli civilians and some military members. And that is, in essence, an element of retribution that the Israeli government has decided they want to exact on Hamas, and by extension, maybe not deliberately, but the end effect is it's also on the people of Gaza, some of whom, like I said, are connected to Hamas, others maybe not so much. So the problem from a strategic standpoint is that no matter what Israel does, they are caught in essence in almost a vice, because every time they turn around, if they go after a particular person in the Hamas hierarchy, chances are that they will also be killing a lot of non-combatants, women and children particularly, but also other civilians potentially as well. The problem that the Israelis have is that a lot of the Hamas infrastructure is actually hidden within the civilian infrastructure in Gaza. So that's why you have attacks on hospitals, and it's not excused by international law at all. But the reason the Israelis are doing it, they say, is because a lot of the Hamas leadership, their bunkers, their weapons supplies, in some cases their weapons factories, are all connected physically to institutions like schools and hospitals. And that's why you see bombings of places like the Al-Shifa hospital, bombings of the UNRWA school. All of those kinds of things are happening. And unfortunately for the Israelis, that doesn't work when it comes to both international law and the law of armed conflict, as well as public opinion around the world. Very few people, a lot of people had a lot of sympathy for Israel after the October 7 attacks, but these kinds of attacks and the very high civilian death toll in Gaza, that creates a major issue for the Israelis, and it becomes really hard for them to extricate themselves from this. If their goal is to eliminate Hamas, they're really talking about eliminating an ideology, and you can't really do that using a force-on-force approach, and that's the difficulty that the Israelis find themselves in. So if you're looking at this, if you turned away from it for a while and now you're coming back to it, and basically you say, this is the same kind of stuff that I saw a few weeks ago or a few months ago, and the answer is, yeah, that's exactly what this is. The problem is it's a morass. It's like quicksand. The Israelis get in there and they really have a very difficult time getting out of this, because they can't achieve a lot of their strategic goals. So they keep fighting, they keep killing. And then on the other hand, Hamas is not, they're crippled, they're hurt in many respects, but there's still elements of them that are fighting there. And as long as they continue the fight, it looks to the Israeli government as if they still haven't achieved that goal of eliminating Hamas. So it's a vicious cycle that they're creating. And that vicious cycle is, of course, something that the US government and other governments, especially Egypt, Qatar, and some of the other regional players are looking at trying to cut that vicious cycle, but it's still continuing, and that is a major problem for the Israelis. It's very hard to extricate themselves from this, especially if they don't achieve the goal. They'll have to, in some ways, change the terms of what they say their goals are, and in essence, declare some form of victory in order to pull themselves out of this.
Colonel, for the sake of the hostages, are we looking at potentially a struggle of sharing intelligence? You just mentioned several nations a moment ago. You would think in a hostage situation, and obviously, we're dealing with hostages that are kept within tunnels, but is there a gap here about information not being shared if the intended goal, aside from the eradication of Hamas, which I agree with you is a much larger conversation, but if we're just trying to get these folks home, is there a lack of information sharing that may be potentially holding this matter up?
It's a potential, and I don't think we know exactly, what some of the intelligence issues are. But one thing I can tell you, based on the kinds of work that we did in several operations, including the operation to get Osama bin Laden, it took a long time to get the kind of information that had that fidelity that you're looking for a special operations type mission. And when it comes to hostages, you want to have as much fidelity as you possibly can. When I used to work at U.S. Special Operations Command, one of the colonels that I worked for, I was a captain at the time. One of the colonels that I worked for was kind of an old crusty guy and probably younger than I am now. But he said, the thing that I am really interested in is which way the door handles turn. And so when it comes to intelligence, it has to be so precise that when you know that there are hostages in a certain area, and the Israelis have some good experience in this area, they want to know not only what room they're in, but also which way do the door handles turn? What way does the exit? How does the exit work? What doors are reach the outside? What windows are there? Is it some kind of a facility that they can get into and out of without being detected? So all of those kinds of questions become really important. And if there is a gap in intelligence, which makes it hard to conduct those kinds of operations or even plan for those kinds of operations, such as a hostage rescue operation, that could very well impede the ability of the Israelis to go in and actually conduct those missions successfully.
Colonel, staying on what we were just talking about before about, within the public domain right now, it's something that's kind of been lost as I pivot to the war in Ukraine, has been this war in Ukraine up until last week, with the NATO summit that happened here in Washington, D.C. And I know Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was in Washington, D.C. Outside of the infighting for congressional aid and weapons and munition being sent to Ukraine, a lot of the coverage of the war in Ukraine has been lost. And something that I just noticed, we're entering day 870 as of this recording right now of the conflict. So we're going to look at the war holistically and kind of what is the latest there. But I did want to play for you first something that President Biden said last week in this Ukraine compact that he announced with a bunch of other foreign leaders and dignitaries around him and introducing President Zelensky to the podium. I want to play for you and then ask you a question on the other side. So take a listen to this.
This compact brings all those countries together in a unified, coordinated, and comprehensive architecture to support Ukraine, not just for now, but for years in the future. In the short term, we'll continue to supply Ukraine with the weapons, munitions, and training they need to repel Russian forces. In the medium term, we'll help build a future force that has the strength and the capabilities both to defend Ukraine and deter further aggression. In the long term, after this war is over, if Putin ever tries it again, All the countries that endorsed the compact have pledged to have Ukraine's back, just like we have it now.
All right, so Colonel, there's probably a two-parter there because first, can you explain this Ukraine compact? Because what I thought that's what NATO was for. And I know Ukraine's not a member of NATO and they're trying to fast track their application, but can you kind of explain what this Ukraine compact is that was announced last week by the president and these other nations you and I were talking offline that are a part of this, Poland and Sweden and Spain and Portugal and a few others on the list, and you can go check that out at whitehouse.gov, that announcement. But explain a little bit of not only the compact, but then also the importance of Ukraine and this war right now, and why maybe it was at the beginning of all of this, months and now 2 years ago, where people were talking about this and foreign policy was kind of top of mind with these two wars. Now this one has kind of been lost in the shuffle. So can you explain a little bit of the Ukraine compact and why this is important to us?
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. So the Ukraine compact, I think one way to look at it is kind of like NATO light. And what I mean by that is it doesn't have the same exact protections that Ukraine would get if it were a bona fide member of NATO, where you have Article 5 protections, Article 5 meaning if one is attacked, all are attacked, and they will all come to aid the country is being attacked. This is kind of like that, except it is not as concrete a set of treaty obligations as you have with the NATO treaty. But what they're trying to do at the White House and with the NATO member nations that signed on to this compact is create a web of alliances. It's somewhat similar to what happened in Europe between World War I and World War II, where a lot of different countries in Eastern Europe had alliances with each other or with countries like France and Britain to protect themselves from countries like Germany and the Soviet Union at that time. This is obviously a little bit different than that, but basically what the compact does is it obligates the countries that signed on to it, the 30 plus countries that have an agreement with Ukraine. It allows them to provide support to the Ukrainians in the form of weapon systems, in the form of financial aid, in the form of training, and it basically is set up so that it augments what the Ukrainians are able to do on their own. Now, given the state of Ukraine, especially now after 870 days of war, Ukraine is a country that is in dire economic situation because a lot of its infrastructure has been attacked and been eliminated by the Russian attacks, and in many cases it was Soviet era infrastructure that they inherited when they became independent from the Soviet Union back in early 1991 or so. So when these compacts were set up just recently, the big idea was to create some kind of a web of alliances that would give the Ukrainians kind of in essence, like a porcupine impact. In other words, the Ukrainians would become strong enough through aid from the West, aid from other countries, so that they would have the weapon systems. They would start getting things like F-16s, the advanced tactical army missile systems, the ATACMS, the HIMARS systems, other systems like that would make it really difficult for the Russians to advance even further into Ukrainian territory. So the goal, in essence, even though they're not going to say it this way, is to stabilize the frontline situation in Ukraine and prevent the Russians from taking more territory. If the Ukrainians develop the tactics that they need to and have the weapon systems that they're ready to retake some of the territory that the Russians have taken from them, that's okay with the US and that's okay with NATO. But the basic supposition is that if Ukraine can at least hold what it has right now, that it allows it to stay as a sovereign country. If they can't hold what they have, like if they lose the second city of Kharkiv, if they lost territory, in the east and the south, that would be a potential problem, and that could change the equation there. But the basic reason that this is so important, why these compacts exist, is because it would be impossible right now to give Ukraine, politically impossible to give Ukraine full NATO membership. So barring full NATO membership, because it's a state that's in conflict right now with Russia, the next best thing, as far as the US and others are concerned, is to give Ukraine these mechanisms so that it serves as a means of backstopping the Ukrainians. It also is designed to give the Russians some pause so that they realize that the Ukrainians are not going to be an easy enemy to conquer. They thought they could march into Kyiv when they first started this back in February of 2022. They could march into Kyiv within 3 to 4 days. That obviously did not happen. And the goal is to never have that happen, to protect the Zelensky government, to protect the institutions of a free and democratic Ukraine. But the reason this is important is because a lot of people in the West are looking at this and they're saying, if Russia is successful in conquering Ukraine or eliminating the Ukrainian government as it currently exists and creating what amounts to a satellite state of Russia, that would weaken NATO. It would also mean that there would be Russian troops on NATO's doorstep more than there are right now. And those elements in Russia that would move into Ukraine could then potentially be used to go into Poland and into the Baltic states and countries like that, so that it would, in essence, create a situation where the possibility of a major conflict between NATO and Russia would be more likely instead of less likely. So the idea is, if the war is confined to Ukraine, then the chance of a big conflict between NATO and Russia is lessened. So that's the theory behind it all. Whether or not it all works out in practice is, of course, remains to be seen. But generally speaking, it does make sense to make the Russians concentrate their efforts in Ukraine and prevent them from moving into other parts, especially NATO countries, which would then trigger the Article 5 protections that we mentioned earlier.
Colonel, it seems like when this conflict started, this invasion, to be bluntly, started, there was obviously the recognition that Ukraine has managed to hold out a lot longer than any of us imagined. And then obviously we saw the constant onslaught from the Russian forces. As we're now at this point, I believe, over 2 years into this conflict's existence, what's your assessment currently of both as a country for the US, like how we're addressing this, but then also in terms of where Ukraine is right now, with what any hope they have to try to maintain a sense of emphasis or thrust, what hopes do they have just from an objective standpoint, and what, if anything, has Russia done to try to reiterate its efforts or try to re-strategize what may not have been working at the early onset of the invasion?
Yeah, that last part is actually quite interesting, Nick, because what the Russians have actually done, they've innovated a bit. The Ukrainians have been given a lot of credit for using drones and for being quite innovative with their own weapon systems. The Russians have been a lot slower to adapt, and they don't have the same incentives like the Ukrainians do in terms of protecting their country, because Ukraine is in essence about a quarter the size of Russia and has about 40, a little less than 40 million people compared to about 140 million that the Russians have, just in terms of overall population. But the Russians have developed some techniques and tactics, especially using electronic warfare, that allow them to overcome some of the previously held Ukrainian advantages, such as in the Ukrainians used to have the ability to use drones that use GPS signals to put bombs on target over Russian tanks, Russian artillery pieces, things like that. In essence, the drones became Ukraine's air force. The way in which the Russians are jamming GPS signals now makes that a lot harder to do. Not impossible, but a lot harder to do. Also, because the Ukrainians don't really have a fixed-wing air force right now, the Russians have, to some degree, established a bit of what we would call air supremacy over certain select areas of the battlefront. And that gives them advantages in some of the places in the east. The Russian goal is still to, at the very least, capture the entirety of the so-called Donbas region, which includes the provinces of, or the oblasts of Donetsk and Luhansk. They have captured almost all of Luhansk. But there is a part of Donetsk that is not in Russian hands, and they're trying very hard to get that. So recently, we've seen the Russians move forward. We may remember the town of Bakhmut that over a year ago fell to the Russians, and just 10 kilometers or 6 miles away from Bakhmut is a place called Chasiv Yar. So after all this time, the Russians have finally moved into the outskirts of Chasiv Yar. So I mentioned that just as an example that the Russians are going to make slow and steady progress in some areas of the front, but it's not something that happens quickly, and it's not something where they're moving very rapidly. And so what that means is that the Russians and the Ukrainians have basically settled into this war of attrition. And this war of attrition is dangerous for both sides, but it's particularly dangerous for the Ukrainians because of those disparities in population and, by extension, in manpower than for their military. So the Russians, are gaining some ground in certain areas, but they've also been repelled in other areas. For example, their attacks on Kharkiv in the northeast of Ukraine have basically been thwarted by the Ukrainians because they've been allowed to use US and other weapon systems that actually are allowed to hit targets inside Russia now. That's important. And in fact, I think that given the state of the war right now, it becomes important for us to take as many of the shackles off as we can to give the Ukrainians the ability to go after Russian standoff weapons. And standoff weapons are the weapons that they fire from their airspace, from their territory, that then hit Ukrainian targets. Those are the weapons that are creating a lot of the problems for the Ukrainian infrastructure. They're hitting the hospitals. Their latest example was the children's hospital that was hit in Kyiv, to a great deal of destruction and the basic attempt to annihilate parts of the Ukrainian healthcare system. So these are the kinds of things that we must help the Ukrainians protect against. And that's why President Zelensky of Ukraine is always trying so hard to get air defense assets into the country, and then, of course, augment those with things like the F-16 and other weapon systems that can help move the Ukrainians at least to a point where they can defend themselves better against these Russian attacks.
Colonel Cedric Leighton, I can see why you have taught before, and I can see why the American people appreciate your analysis, your analysis, on CNN. You can catch all of his segments over on CNN International. Watch it on Max, retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Leighton. I can't thank you enough for hopping on the program, giving us a couple minutes. Continued success to you, sir. Please stay safe.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Nick. It's great to be with you, and I really appreciate you having me tonight. Thanks so much.
All right, our thank yous there to Colonel Cedric Leighton. Like I mentioned, retired U.S. Air Force Colonel, CNN military analyst. You can check out all of his work, CNN.com, CNN International. If you live internationally and you've seen him on the international feed, you can watch on Max or on the CNN channel there. As always, you want to check out the video portions of any of the interviews we've done, not only with the Colonel, but other guests that have been on the show. Head over to our YouTube channel, type in Can We Please Talk Podcast. We should pop right up. Audio podcast platforms, you know them by now, Apple, Spotify, Google. Shout out to everybody who listens to us over on Good Pods. Shout out to everybody that uses Acast. Shout out to Acast, our hosting platform. We can't do without them. Can't do without each and every one of you that listens into this program. Folks, like the president said, it is time to bring the temperature down. That is my message to everybody as we sign off here. As always, I'm Mike Leon.
And I'm Nick Saveri.
We'll see everybody next time.